would welcome me. I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the sun sets free, always free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. Free at last, he has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the sun sets free, always free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God, yes I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am who you say I am. Who the sun sets free, always free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God, yes I am. I'm a child of God, just a child of God. I'm a child of God, yes I am. You unravel me with a melody. You surround me with a song of deliverance from my enemies, till all my fears are gone. And I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. Sing, from my mother's womb you've chosen me. From my mother's womb you have chosen me. Your love has called my name. I am born again into your family. Your blood flows through my veins. And I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. Worthy of every song we could ever sing. Worthy of all the praise we could ever bring. You're worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. You're worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. Oh, we live for you. Holy, holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in love to those around me. We will build our lives in you. Sing, I will build. I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation. I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation. I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation. I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. I will build my life upon your love. I will put my trust in you
First, we need to do a little furniture moving project. Well, I got to move bales of hay yesterday, so this is much friendlier than the hay, I might add. Since I'm a person who's kind of allergic to hay, I noticed that my bare arms got a little bit of red streaks and scratches all the way up, and from me scratching them afterwards. But we had such a great time at Arunca Fest, and yes, it's green. Can you guess why? The Ducks. I don't think he mentioned them, but they won too. So OSU and U of O both won. That's right. I have to give everybody their props. And yeah, I like to have fun. Now, I know as a Christian, the more spiritual thing would be to say green is for grow. Okay? We're kind of talking about that today. So there you have it. Well, I get to continue this series, but first of all, I want to say hello to our live stream friends and to all of you. And I wanted to tell you how glad I am that we get to spend time together. We do not take this for granted. And are you ready to hear my grandson's latest joke? I told you I was going to do this to you again. Okay, he's got a lot of joke books. So this last week said, Grammy, how does God brew his coffee? And I said, I don't know how. He said, he brews it. Are you catching that? Hebrews? Okay. I told you I was going to bother you. Now, if you're live streaming with us, wherever you are in God's big world, if you still want to connect with us after that joke, we'd love for you to connect during our time. You see, we'd like for you to share a piece of your story, or maybe you have a personal insight as you're listening to the message. Maybe you have something to add to it. That's a place, something you can do in the comments. Or if you're going through a hard time or would just like somebody to listen to you for a little bit, let us know in the comments, and one of our pastors will connect with you. And Carlos invited you to do that as well. But last week, Jared kicked off our series called ACT with a powerful message for anyone who's a part of Evergreen or who wants to be. Because the truth is, and what he talked to us about is a great description of what a disciple is. And I loved it. It's so succinct. The message was more than this, so please listen to the whole thing if you haven't. But I think that it's important that we all operate off this same definition stated so well. A disciple is someone who's following Jesus, being transformed by Jesus, and living on mission with Jesus. So I invite you to read that with me. A disciple is someone who's following Jesus, being transformed by Jesus, and living on mission with Jesus. So what happened next when the crowd of 3,000 plus people, those are just the ones who responded, there were thousands out there, to Peter's message, and they were saved, it says, on the day of Pentecost. This is where our next verb, because every week we have a verb that emerges out of the passage we're looking at in Acts. And that's where our verb comes from this week. Engage. Engage. It's a verb that means to participate or become involved in something, to have your attention and your interest captured by something, and to participate in it. So let's start with something that we all do at least some of the time. Okay, but we can all relate to it. Making your bed. I know you wanted to talk about this morning. Okay, are you ready for this poll? Now, in order to really learn from this, we need for you to be honest. Okay? There will be no judgment in the room about how often you make your bed. Okay, we want to use thinking about making the bed as a way to think about what it means to engage. So Dr. Randall Bell, who has his PhD, has been studying high-achieving people in all stages, ages, and walks of life for 25 years. And the thing is, he's been looking for factors that high-achieving people experience in common. Things that you see across all of our lives. And one key factor that he found that was present in almost all their lives was this one task of making their bed every morning. So now I want to check with you and find out how you do at making your bed. Okay, we won't determine whether you're high achieving or not, okay? Because people that he was only studying them. So I'm sure that you're amazing, but hands up. We want to look at frequency first. Hands up if you make your bed every day. Okay, hands up if you make your bed most days. Okay, and hands up if you make your bed once in a while. All right. Okay, there we've got the honest people piping in. Okay, that covers frequency, but we know that engagement is more than just the frequency with which we do something or are interested in something or participate in something. It's also about the effort that we give toward it. So let's talk about that. I have 3 images up here. Get your hands ready. And we've got one, the fully made bed. Now, yours might not look as beautiful or pristine as that one, but it's fully made, right? And number 2 is the, well, let's say unmade bed with a happy dog on it, okay? And number 3 is the half-made bed. Okay, half of it's even without sheets if you really look at the picture. But all this to say, which one are we most likely to find in your house? How many say number 1? When you say making the bed, that's what it means. How many say number 2? That's what you mean when you say make the bed. All right. And how many say number 3, the partially made? Okay, we've got some in every category there. So that's a way to think about engagement. What observations would you have about engagement after doing that exercise? Well, I know one is about this frequency and the effort that you put into it. Because, I mean, if you look at those 3 pictures, a different amount of effort is required for each of those. So when we say we're engaged in something, it can look really different from person to person, right? Let's read about what it looked like for the early church to engage. As I read this, I would really like it's a very familiar passage for many people. It's Acts 2, verses 42 through 47. And as I read it, I'd like you to listen for the verbs and the picture we get of these believers' level of participation, because I'm going to ask you to rate that at the end of it. Here's what it says. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. And everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. And all the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. And every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So, given that engage means to participate or become involved in, to have your interest or attention or participation captured, what rating would you give the early church's engagement in the church? How many would say it was low? How many would say it was in the middle? How many would say it was high? Yeah, I mean, this whole paragraph, it's almost a duh question, right? I don't mean to insult you with that, but more that it emphasizes to us that this is a picture of high engagement. So engagement starts with a shared commitment. Luke uses the word devoted. Now, the Greek word there is a common word that means to have this steadfast, single-minded commitment to a very certain course of action. And it's used earlier, interestingly, in Acts 1:14, when the 120 people were gathered in the upper room. It says they were praying together, they were devoted to prayer, and they were waiting for the power from on high that Jesus promised them, right there in Jerusalem in that upper room. Same word there, this steadfast devotion to a particular action or commitment. And then it's used again in Acts 6, verse 4, and that's the chapter where we have the dispute about whether the Greek widows are being served as well as the Jewish widows. And they say they appointed a whole group of leaders to wait tables, to distribute the food, because they said the apostles needed to be devoted to ministry of the word and prayer. Those were their particular things that they were to be committed to. So in the early church, the believers were devoted or committed to 4 things: teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer. That's straight out of the passage language. But engagement for the believers in the early church meant their interest, their attention, and their participation were wrapped up in these 4 experiences. I like to think of them experiences, not just actions, but experiences that they had together. So let's look at those 4 one at a time. And I want to let you know in advance, I'm going to spend most I'm going to spend much more time on the first one, because without the first one, the others aren't going to happen. So let's talk about that first one. Show up to grow up together. Luke uses the word together 3 or 4 times in this brief description of the early church. It really depends on which translation you're reading, how many times you get to see that word. The believers were not flying solo in their faith. They were connected and engaged with one another, and in ways that encouraged and sustained and grew their relationship with Jesus. Now, their favorite meeting place, we're told, was the temple at the eastern edge of the outer court, and it was called Solomon's Colonnade. Jesus used to collect there, and crowds would collect, and he would be teaching. And they continued that after Jesus' death and resurrection as people who were his emissaries, his representatives, his ambassadors. So the disciples would go there, and they'd carry on discussions and the apostles' teaching. And I want to mention that apostles' teaching, they only had Old Testament books. They didn't have New Testament. So they weren't getting up and talking about this. And they weren't talking about some of the passages I'll read. They were talking about what the apostles had taught, what they'd heard Jesus pass on to them. So those were the teachings that they were offering to the people and having discussions about. And it says they offered offered praise to God there. But the thing is, Luke says they were doing this every day. That's kind of mind-blowing if you think about it. These were people who had households to maintain. These were people who had jobs to carry on, livings to make. These were people very much like us who had kids to watch after. But they were doing this every day. You get the feeling when you read this that it was not a have-to experience, but a want-to experience. Didn't you feel that in the passage? There's no sense of obligation in the way Dr. Luke described the early church. Well, I'm thinking about the difference. Sometimes, if you've raised teenagers, you might know that sometimes there are want-to mornings going to church, and sometimes there are have-to mornings going to church. Okay, you may have discovered that with little ones even. It just depends on your kids and their personality. But this was a want-to moment for them. So engagement, it always starts with commitment, this showing up to grow up. But let's talk about this. Their favorite place was there in that colonnade, but their fellowship is the word that's used for the experience that they had together. And fellowship is the Greek word koinonia. I actually grew up going to Camp Koinonia. And so that word was always defined for us. It means to participate, partnership, communion together. So as we engage, partner, or participate with our faith community, we experience the transforming work of Jesus in our lives. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, since we're talking about that. The pandemic has changed how we do that, how we gather, how we collect and connect together. Many people have changed their habits, and new ways of being together have emerged. For some, the pandemic has rearranged our priorities. And for others, it's accelerated the decline in the participation with other believers in some form of church. Remember, I'm just using all the forms possible. In fact, the third quarter of 2020, Unstuck Church issued this report that revealed that among the churches surveyed, attendance or participation at church services was 36% what it was pre-COVID. Now, Evergreen's in-person attendance numbers are higher than this, but they have right about 50% of what they were pre-COVID. And parenting church plants as we came back to in-person gatherings is a factor in ours. And we won't apologize for that, because parenting churches is a part of our commitment to be multipliers. We send to extend, so that's a part of what we do. But I want to take a look with you at the Barna study research that they came out with. And I don't always use a thing like this, but I want us to see this. So you see the Big C church across the U.S. and get a picture of what's going on. And here's some observations I'll make. 41% of Gen Z say that when COVID's over, they want to return to primarily in-person worship. That means 59% don't. 42% of millennials say they prefer primarily in-person worship. That means 58% don't. Parents of kids, especially kids who are still at home, are looking at hybrid approaches to gathering more than non-parents or people whose kids are grown. And as most of us know, the majority of boomers, many more, still prefer in person. But only a minority of millennial, Gen Z, and Gen X want to primarily gather in person in the future. Now, what does all of this mean when I talk about showing up to grow up, which is what the early church shows us? The church is emerging from the pandemic in different forms. Some of them are wholly digital, that's all online. Others are hybrid, which is a blend of both. And still others are in person. And each of these is to engage in a faith community. And Evergreen is a part of this. You know, we're engaged in preparing a fully digital expression of church while offering hybrid and in person. And we hope to have the studio that we're outfitting finished in a few weeks. And then we'll begin filming a podcast that'll be part of reaching an online community of young families and their kids as we prepare to plant a digital church. The podcast won't be the plant, it's the precursor. It's the appetizer to it. It's the attracting those people to it by talking about things that they're interested in this podcast. Now, you may have noticed that there are people in every generation that still want to gather in person for a faith community experience. Because 41% of Gen Z, 42% of Generation Millennials, and 70-some% of Boomers, and Gen Xers are right in there as well, in between the Millennials and the Boomers. That's a lot of people that still want to meet in person. So what we're talking about is not instead of, it's a both and. It's the form of church is socially and culturally informed. It has been across the centuries. There's many ways to accomplish church. And a lot of those have been tied to cultural constructs. And it's true in our day. And COVID has accelerated that process. So the digital church plant is not instead of, but in addition to the in-person. So why is all of this so important? Because the non-negotiable for every believer in Jesus is growing in our relationship with Jesus, being transformed by him and being on mission with him. And that happens best in community, whatever form that takes. And the form that the community takes can vary widely. I want to share a couple examples with you this morning. Remember, we're trying to help God lift us up to see some of the things he's seen in Big C Church and where we're going together. So Joe Franz planted brewpastors.com. That's right, I have the website up here. It's got a much prettier thing at the top, but this is on the home page. And I got to hear him this last week while we were in Chicago and got to have dinner with him and just talk with him about this. But he noticed how many meaningful conversations he was having while having a beer at his local brewery. So he did some research and he learned that 75% of Americans that are drinking age, that is 21 and above, he didn't go for the younger ages, live within 10 miles of a brewery. So God began to show him how he could tap into this collection of people and take church to the brewery instead of getting the people there to come to another place. And thus, Brew Pastors was born, and he was the first brew pastor. He builds relationships with the breweries, and he begins to serve them, and he begins to meet people there. And online, he offers a way for them to contact him if they need somebody to listen to them. And so a lot of the relationships start online, and then they meet for a beer, and then they start talking over that about the things that they're struggling with. And he builds relationships with the brewery, and they serve the communities that the breweries are in. They go and help the breweries with their functions, not with functions they plan. But if the brewery wants to do a festival, then they help with it. They go around, set up tents and sweep and you name it. They do cleanup. They'll do anything that helps that brewmaster. And they build these relationships and serve them in the community they're in. And then, as the relationships develop, he and other brew pastors have now started beer and Bible groups. I bet you never thought those two would go together. Okay, I'll just say I didn't. Okay, he started, and everybody who knows me thinks that's funny. He started in Canton, Ohio, and it is growing. There are multiple locations in Ohio, and there are now multiple sites in 7 other states. And people are coming to Jesus. So I want you to know something now. Anybody who knows me knows that I can have an attitude about alcohol. So I grew up with a dad who's an alcoholic. And so when I first had Joe get up there and share his story with us in the group, I'm just going to be perfectly honest and tell you what was going through my mind and the tone that it was being thought of in my mind. I thought, oh, great, just what the world needs, more reinforcement in medicating their pain and anxiety with alcohol. That's what I thought. So I was a skeptic at best when he started, and really through about halfway of the presentation, then the Lord reminded me of how I used to pray that some Christian guys that I knew would go to the bars that my dad hung out at regularly and would sit down next to him and have a beer with him and start talking to him and listening to his story and perhaps engage him in his pain. You know, I had a couple pastors come visit my house to see my dad, and my dad chased him off our property. You see, that strategy of going straight to the home, that wasn't going to work for my dad. And I used to literally pray this, and what God showed me is, hey, Ann, this is an answer to prayer. It's not for your dad, but it's for other people's. People who are struggling with pain and low self-regard and all sorts of other things that drive people to drink more than they should or to seek solace in alcohol instead of in Jesus. And so, I mean, halfway through, I was like, this is cool. This is awesome what he's doing. I was really grateful for it. And that night, I got to have dinner with him, and we were just all talking together at the table, and I said, I just have one question. I want to know, what do you do if you discover somebody's really struggling with alcohol? Because a lot of people aren't. They're just having a beer on their way home from work, right? They're kind of, defusing, downloading before they go home. And so I asked him that, and he said, well, you'll notice that Celebrate Recovery is a button on our site. And he says, we honestly haven't encountered as many yet. He said, but I think I've just met my first one. But he's not going right to that because it's a relationship. That's what Jesus does. And so, I mean, this was just exciting to me. Well, Brew Pastors is a hybrid. It has both in-person experience and online. And you'll see it if you go on and search out the website. You'll see some of that. Maybe God's going to call some of you to be a brew pastor. So can people experience the full discipleship pathway in a digital faith community? That's the question being asked by a lot of leaders and pastors right now. And those are great questions to ask. Jared and I recently launched a nonprofit called Sprout Digital to do research on this very question of all the current digital-only church plants in the U.S. and discover the answers to some of the questions we have about that. Can they really fulfill all the parts of the discipleship pathway? How will they